Matthew chapter 2 introduces us to the reality of the first advent of Jesus Christ. And yet, at the same time, it's important for us to remember that Christ's first advent, that's what we call it, was in one sense not his first advent. It was really his return. Because the eternal Son of God, the second person of the Trinity, has often been in this world that he created before that first Christmas day. You remember he was there at creation. John tells us that he made everything, and without him, not anything was made that exists. It was the second person of the Trinity, the eternal Son of God, that walked with Adam and Eve in the cool of the garden. It was he who appeared to Abraham and to Isaac and to Jacob, to Moses in the burning bush, and later, those days he spent on Mount Sinai. It was the eternal Son of God who was with Israel throughout the Exodus, who was the pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night. He was, throughout Old Testament history, appearing in a mysterious figure called the angel of the Lord. And it was his glory that overshadowed the Holy of Holies in the tabernacle and later in the temple. It was the second person of the Trinity that appeared to the prophets. You see, he has always been the mediator between God and man. And so when we read in Matthew chapter 1, verse 25, that Mary gave birth to a son and Joseph called his name Jesus, understand that this is in reality not his coming, but his return. So why was it different? What made this time unique is that unlike all other times, he came as one of us. He became fully human. In fact, when we first meet him in Matthew's Gospel in chapter 2, he is a small human child, less than 2 years old. You know, we talk about this at Christmas time, and we celebrate this, and we talk about the baby in a manger. I'm not sure we ever really get the fact that we're talking about God, the Creator, becoming a creature, becoming one of us. But it's important to understand that he didn't just come as an ordinary human child. No, he came as a king. He was an ordinary human child in the sense that he was like us, body and soul, but he was non-ordinary in terms of who he was. He came as king. And this week and next, as we celebrate Christmas, I want us to examine a remarkable account that happened shortly after Jesus' birth. It's an account that's familiar to every one of us here. And yet, like so many things that are familiar, I think most of us here this morning have never really reflected deeply on this account. We don't really understand it, and we don't really come to grips with its far-reaching implications. I'm talking about the story of the Magi. Now, let me just at the beginning say to you that I'm going to pronounce it that way throughout this sermon, Magi, because, as I learned a few years ago, that is the only pronunciation in the dictionary. So in the interest of being correct, that's what I'm going to do. Let's read it together. Matthew chapter 2, beginning in verse 1. Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, Magi from the east arrived in Jerusalem, saying, "Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star in the east and have come to worship him." When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. Gathering together all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. They said to him, "In Bethlehem of Judea, for this is what has been written by the prophet. And you, Bethlehem, land of Judah, are by no means least among the leaders of Judah, for out of you shall come forth a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." Then Herod secretly called the Magi and determined from them the exact time the star appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem and said, Go and search carefully for the child. And when you found him, report to me so that I too may come and worship him." After hearing the king, they went their way. And the star which they had seen in the east went on before them until it came and stood over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. After coming into the house, they saw the child with Mary his mother, and they fell to the ground and worshiped him. Then, opening their treasures, they presented to him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned by God in a dream not to return to Herod, the Magi left for their own country by another way. Now, this account is obviously very important to Matthew. After all, as we just saw in Matthew chapter 1, verse 25, Matthew records the actual birth of Christ in part of one verse. And yet he spends most of chapter 2 filling out this account. As well, when you come to the end of chapter 2, between chapter 2 and chapter 3, there is a gap of almost 30 years. From the time Jesus was less than 2 years of age until he was about 30 years of age, and the ministry of John the Baptist begins in chapter 3. It would have been very possible for Matthew to have skipped this incident altogether. After all, none of the other Gospels record it. But Matthew includes it because it is crucial to his purpose for writing this Gospel. Over the next 2 weeks, as we study this passage, I trust its theme will become clear, but let me give it to you just so you are sure not to miss it. Here is the theme of this paragraph, and really of the entire book. Jesus is the Messiah and the only rightful king. He is the King of the Jews. He is the King of all the earth. He is the King of every man. Make no mistake, Jesus is the main character in this story. The reason the other actors appear, including the Magi, is simply as a foil so that we can see the reflection of their response to the king. Matthew is going to make it clear that Jesus is the main character of this story as he unfolds this account which has captivated Christians for 2,000 years. But he begins by introducing us to the setting in which this event occurs and introducing us to the supporting cast, which are still important to the story. We find the setting and the supporting cast introduced in verses 1 and 2. Look at them again. Now, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, Magi from the east arrived in Jerusalem, saying, "Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star in the east and have come to worship him." Now, let me just warn you, that is as far as we will get this week. Lord willing, next Sunday morning, on Christmas morning, we will fill out the rest of the story and really the heart of the story. But today, I want us just to set the stage as Matthew does here in these first 2 verses. So let's begin by looking at the story's setting. The story's setting. Matthew wrote his gospel to the Jews, and he wrote it in order to present Jesus as king, but not just another king of Israel, rather as the king who would be Israel's long-promised divine Messiah. Go back to chapter 1, verse 1. Matthew immediately informs us that this is his purpose. Matthew chapter 1, verse 1, he begins by saying, "The record of the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham." He begins with his thesis, and then he embarks in a genealogy there in chapter 1, which exists to prove that Jesus is in the rightful line of kings, that he descended from King David, and therefore he is qualified not only to be a king of Israel, but to be the Messiah. He is a legal descendant of David, through his adoptive father, Joseph. You remember that Mary and Joseph were betrothed. They were engaged. Under Jewish law, that meant that any child Mary had would become legally Joseph's, even if that child was not actually his. And so Jesus is a legal descendant of David through his legal father, Joseph. Then there is the record we read earlier of the birth announcement to Joseph, and he takes Mary, and Jesus is born at the end of chapter 1. Now, when you get to chapter 2, Matthew embarks to show us that after the birth of this one who was the long-promised Messiah, he is affirmed as King and Messiah. That affirmation in all the gospel records comes from several unlikely sources. In fact, I thought this Christmas about studying Luke's account of Jesus' presentation at the temple when the old Simeon comes up and prophesies over Jesus, or when Anna recognizes him to be Israel's Messiah. So the witnesses to his being Messiah are most unlikely and unusual, but I think none of them more so than the witness of those we call the Magi, or perhaps in your translation, the wise men. What I want us to do is see if we can sort of separate the truth from all of the fiction that's grown up around this story. First of all, we need to consider, when did they come? When did the Magi come? Well, verse 1 makes this clear to us. First of all, generally, Matthew tells us in verse 1, this happened after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea. That's obvious, but it's there for the record. Matthew records Jesus' actual birth, as I said, in just one verse, chapter 1, verse 25. And in chapter 2, verse 1, we learn where he was born, in Bethlehem of Judea. The reason Matthew says that is there are two Bethlehems in Israel. One of them is in the north, in Galilee, but then there is the one in the south, in Judea. This one, the one where Jesus was born, is located about 6 miles south of Jerusalem. Its name, Bethlehem, simply means house of bread because it was rich in agriculture. In fact, there were granaries there, and so it's the house of bread. It's really a small, insignificant town. At the time of Christ, there were probably less than 1,000 people who lived there. Fewer people than will attend our services this morning were in the town of Bethlehem. But it was significant for two events that occurred there in the Old Testament. The first of those was the meeting and marriage of Ruth and Boaz in the book of Ruth. And because of that, the second one was true, and that is the birth of their eventual ancestor, David, who was born and raised in Bethlehem. And so this small, insignificant village figures large in the history of the nation. It was the city that produced the entire Davidic dynasty that ruled over the southern part of Israel for more than 400 years. It was after Jesus was born, that's when the Magi came. Now, Matthew adds that these events happened in the days of Herod the king, verse 1. In the days of Herod the king. This is Herod the Great. He reigned from 40 BC until his death in the spring of the year 4 BC. We'll learn more about him next week, but just suffice it to say, he became king over Judah and Judea in 40 BC and reigned until the spring of 4 BC. Now that tells us when the birth of Christ was. We know from this story that Jesus was born before Herod's death. That means that Jesus had to have been born somewhere between 4 and 6 BC. When they started hundreds of years later to calculate the turn of the era, the Christian era, obviously there was some miscalculation that went on, but they got close, all right? So somewhere 4 to 6 BC. So they came after Jesus was born. They came in the days of Herod the king. There are a couple of other time clues that are important. A third one is that this incident had to occur at least 40 days after Jesus' birth. And that's true for a couple of reasons. We know the Magi were not there on the night of Jesus' birth. You remember when the shepherds found Jesus, they found him in a stable. Actually, you can visit the place where Jesus was born, almost certainly. You can visit it today. It's a cave near Bethlehem. It is one of those sites that, there are few of them in Israel, but one of those that is almost certainly authentic. Many of us have had the chance to be there, and perhaps as a church we'll have the chance to go back again. You can visit this place. It was a cave, hewn out by shepherds and weather and time, where Jesus was born. But in this incident, notice verse 11, we find Jesus living in a house in Bethlehem. So I hate to tell you, I hate to sort of rain on your creche, rain on your nativity set, but mine has it too, but they almost certainly were not there on the night of Jesus' birth. If you piece together the timeline from the other Gospels, here's how it unfolds. Jesus is born, and then you have 8 days later, he was circumcised and named Jesus, as the angel had said both to Mary and to Joseph. Then 40 days after his birth, he's taken to the temple in Jerusalem. Mary and Joseph leave Bethlehem. They travel 6 miles north to Jerusalem, and there, according to the law, where the firstborn was to be presented to the Lord, they present Jesus at the temple. What happened that day is recorded in Luke 2, verses 22 to 38. According to Luke 2:39, after those 40 days, after the dedication of Jesus at the temple, they returned to Nazareth, apparently just to collect their things and to actually move to Bethlehem, because the next time that we find them, they're living in a house in Bethlehem. And after this account that we're studying together, you remember they traveled to Egypt to escape Herod. They come back intending to resettle in Bethlehem, but because of the political situation, they can't. So they get their things and they go back to Nazareth, and that's where Jesus grows up, so that the prophecies about him could all be fulfilled. So that's one way that we understand some time had passed. In addition to that, another way we know that it was probably 40 days that passed after Jesus' birth, before the Magi came, is the travel time that was required of the Magi. They likely came from Babylon, as we'll talk about in a moment, and the main trade route from Babylon to Israel was about 800 miles. If they traveled the average of 20 miles a day, remember the star appears at the time of Jesus' birth, they traveled the average of 20 miles a day, which is what they traveled in those days. It would have taken about 40 days to have traveled the distance between Babylon and Bethlehem. So taking all the evidence together then, the events of Matthew 2 occurred at least 40 days after Jesus had been born. There's one other time clue, and that is, we know that the Magi arrived less than 2 years after Jesus' birth because of this story. Remember in verse 7, Herod investigated the exact time the star appeared so he could pinpoint the time of Jesus' birth. And then tragically, down in verse 16, Herod murdered all of the children 2 years of age and younger in Bethlehem and its surroundings. Why? Because he had ascertained the timing of the star appearing, the age of the child, and knowing Herod's wicked nature, he had undoubtedly allowed a margin of error. So somewhere less than 2 years. 40 days to 2 years. Now notice verse 1 says that they arrived in Jerusalem. The star appeared at the time of Jesus' birth. By the way, there is no indication in the text here that the star led them all the way to Israel. In fact, it seems to imply exactly the opposite. And they didn't need the star to lead them to Israel. They already knew this was going to be the king of the Jews, so they knew where to go. And where would they go but to the capital city of Israel, where its current king reigned? That's where they would expect the king of the Jews to be born and where they would expect to find him. So That's the story's setting. That's sort of the time setting in which all of this occurs. But also in these opening verses, we meet the main supporting cast. The main supporting cast. Who were they? Well, they were the Magi. Who exactly were these men, though, that arrived in Jerusalem and unsettled an entire city? Notice how verse 1 describes them. They were Magi from the east. It's interesting how this simple gospel account has grown into a legend that is larger than life. In fact, much of what you have heard about these men is absolute fiction. So before we lay a foundation for what the Scripture does teach, let's sort of clear the way here by making it clear what the Scripture does not teach about them. That is in all the popular stories of Christmas. First of all, they were not kings. They were not kings. There's no record anywhere that they were kings. That apparently began because there are Old Testament passages that say that kings will worship the Messiah, but they are not specific prophecies of these men. In fact, we know from history they were not kings. Instead, they were king makers, which factors even more importantly into the story. Secondly, there probably weren't three of them. There, again, is no record anywhere that there were three. That's an idea that arose naturally from the fact that there were three gifts. We just don't know how many there were, but there's no indication in the text. There is no historical basis for believing the tradition that didn't arise until near the end of the 6th century that we know their names. You probably heard them: Gaspar, Balthazar, and originally Melkon, who was later changed to Melchior. One of them was probably not an Ethiopian. That idea comes from a misunderstanding, thinking there were three of them, and some have even hypothesized that maybe they were descendants of the three sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and therefore over time manifest different racial makeup. There's no indication of that biblically. And let me say that it's almost certainly not true that the three skulls found 1,000 years later by the Bishop of Cologne that are now on exhibition in the cathedral there are in any way authentic and the skulls of these men. Now, all of that is legend. None of that is in the inspired text. But let me just say to you that the truth about these men is frankly stranger than the fiction that has grown up around them. Let's look at it together. There's so much we can learn about them from history, both biblical history, which we'll see in this text, as well as secular history. Let's begin there. According to Herodotus, the ancient Greek historian, the Magi were originally members of a Persian priestly caste. A Persian priestly caste. In other words, they were from what is modern Iran. They were teachers of science and religion. When it came to science, they studied astronomy, medicine, mathematics, and philosophy. They were also the legal authorities of their world. In fact, our word magistrate comes from the word magi. In ancient Persia, they were men of particular power and influence because it was given to this priestly caste to anoint and acknowledge the next king. They weren't kings, but they were king makers. And immediately you can see how that factors into the story of Jesus. They are also credited in their scientific endeavors with establishing the foundation for our understanding of the planetary system, the computation and tracking of time, and the establishment of the calendar. Over time, their name came to be used of anyone in any nation that carried on the same practices. We especially find other magi in ancient Babylon. In fact, in Daniel's prophecy, we find this group showing up on several occasions. It's interesting, there's a cross-reference to that in Jeremiah. In Jeremiah 39:3, Jeremiah refers to one of the main officials in the court of the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar as the Rob Mag. That's a title. It's a title that means the chief of the Magi. So in Nebuchadnezzar's court, in Babylon, there was this caste, this priestly caste called the Magi. Now, we've talked about their scientific endeavors, but they were also into religion. And their religious expertise had a much darker side. They were idolaters. They were experts in astrology, in divination, in incantation. In fact, our English word magic also comes from the word magi and what this ancient caste of men did. Beginning in about the 6th century BC, so about 500 years before Christ, Persia became heavily influenced by the false religion of Zoroastrianism. And that's undoubtedly what these men would have embraced originally. There are similarities between Judaism and the beliefs of Zoroastrianism and the beliefs of the Magi. They were monotheists, for example, and they offered sacrifices in much the same way that we see in the Old Testament. But make no mistake, their religion was merely a satanic counterfeit of faith in the true God. The Magi, we know, were involved in a number of practices that are explicitly forbidden in the Old Testament, like astrology and the divination of dreams. That's what makes the story so remarkable, because as we'll see next week, God cuts through their pagan idolatry to give them an amazing knowledge of the truth. But again, understand, when they arrive, this is who they are. And they were important enough men that they would have come with a large contingent, possibly even a small army. And again, I hate to mess up your creche, but probably not on camels, but on Persian or Arabian horses. We also know that the Magi wore impressive clothes with long cone-shaped hats, very similar to what we still associate with wizards in our day. Trust me, these men didn't sneak into Jerusalem. They were important, influential men who came with a contingent, and when they arrived, they made a splash. No wonder Herod was troubled. Now, the question that comes next is why? Why did they come? Notice their own answer to this. The end of verse 1, Magi from the east arrived in Jerusalem, saying, "Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star in the east and have come to worship him." It's interesting to notice that this is the only thing these men say throughout this entire narrative. This is the point. There was no doubt to them that this king they came seeking had already been born. Notice they don't say, "We come try to find him who will be king of the Jews," but rather the one who is born already to be. He already exists as the king of the Jews. Their question isn't when, but where. Now, what's interesting about the Magi and this understanding of a coming king is when you step back from biblical history and you look at secular history over the same time period, you find that there was this anticipation of a coming world leader who would arise out of Judea. In both, and I read them both this week, in both Suetonius and Tacitus, Roman historians of the first century, they tell us that that time that we refer to as the change of eras between BC and AD, in other words, around the time of Christ, there was a general expectation of a world ruler who would arise from Judea. So the Magi then weren't asking about the birth of just another ordinary run-of-the-mill king of the Jews. No, they came understanding this concept of a world ruler that would somehow arise out of the land of Israel. We see that even in our text. Notice in verse 2, they ask, "Where is he who has been born King of the Jews?" What do they mean by that? Well, we have it explained to us in verse 4. because gathering together all the chief priests and scribes of the people, Herod, having heard about all their questioning, inquired of the leaders, notice this, where not the king of the Jews was to be born, but where whom was to be born? The Messiah. That was what was really going on here. These men had come to Jerusalem because they were convinced that Israel's greatest king, the divine Messiah, had been born. How did they know that? Verse 2 goes on to say, because, here's why we're seeking him, we saw his star in the east and have come to worship him. A better translation of that might be that of the ESV, which says, we saw his star at its rising, or we saw his star when it rose. There's a star connected to the birth of the Messiah. Now, that shouldn't surprise any student of the Old Testament, because in the Old Testament, there is a prophecy that connects a star with the birth of the Messiah. It's an unusual prophecy. It's found in Numbers chapter 24, verse 17. It is the prophecy of Balaam, who was not a prophet of God, but whom God used to speak truth to his people. And Balaam has a prophecy in Numbers 24:17 about Messiah, and this is how it reads. I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star shall come forth from Jacob, a scepter shall rise from Israel. That passage has been understood by the Jews as well as by Christians to be a messianic prophecy, a prophecy about the Messiah, and it connects a star with the coming of Messiah, as well as a scepter. He'll obviously be a ruler. So what exactly then, here in our text in Matthew 2, was the star that the Magi saw? Well, as you know, there's been a lot written, a lot of argument about what the star was. Let me give you the most common answers to the question, what is the star? Some say it was a unique alignment of the planets. And that did happen, by the way, in 7 BC, when Jupiter and Saturn aligned with just about a moon's breadth between them. Would have been a bright specter on the horizon. And some say that's what it was. Others think that this star that they saw was a comet. And again, we can trace back in history, a comet did appear in the years 11 and 12 BC, but of course, that would have been too early. Still others say, no, it wasn't those things. It was a supernova. It was the explosion of a star in distant space and that bright light that lingers sometimes for several months after the explosion of a star. But frankly, it's unlikely that it was any of those things. It's unlikely that it was anything up in the space and the outer heavens themselves. Why? Look at verse 9. The star went on before them until it came and stood over the place where the child was. Whatever the star was, it moved in front of them the 6 miles from Jerusalem south to Bethlehem, and perhaps, and the text is a little unclear, perhaps even indicated which house. Clearly, this was a supernatural phenomenon that in some way resembled a star. It might have been something that God miraculously created for this very event. We just can't be certain. But personally, I think the most likely explanation that supports the surrounding context is that this star was nothing less than the Shekinah glory cloud. It was that blazing manifestation of God's presence that led the people of Israel through the desert, appearing as a blazing cloud by day and as a pillar of fire by night. That blazing display of the presence of God that took up residence in the Old Testament tabernacle and later in the temple. Why do I say that? Because something exactly like this had also appeared to the shepherds on the night of Jesus' birth. Listen to Luke 2:9. An angel of the Lord suddenly stood before them, and the glory of the Lord shone around them. That's what happened to the shepherds. They saw the Shekinah. They saw the glory of God. That blazing display of the glory of God terrified them. And I think it's likely to assume that it was that same manifestation that by God's sovereign providence, the Magi saw while they were still in their own country in Babylon at the time of the birth of Christ. But whatever the star was, we can't be certain, whatever it was, it indicated to them that the time had come for the unique King of the Jews, the divine Messiah, to be born. That raises really the most important question of all, and that is, how did they know? How did they know about the Messiah? Remember, these are idolaters. These are pagans. They're into Zoroastrianism and divination and the occult. How did they come to know about this special king, the Messiah that would be born in Israel? The star provided them with the timing, but that doesn't answer the question, how did they know about the Messiah at all? Well, I think we can piece this together biblically. Remember that they came from the east. We know that much for sure, likely Babylon. 600 years before the birth of Christ, in the year 586 BC, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon had attacked the southern part of Israel, made up primarily of two tribes, Judah and Benjamin, and he had carried most of those people off into captivity back to Babylon. 50 years after Nebuchadnezzar had captured them, the Medes and the Persians in turn overran Babylon, and their leader, a man named Cyrus, allowed the Jews to repatriate, to go back to their home country. But here's what's interesting. Most of the Jews never did. We have the record of how many returned, and it was a small number compared to the number that were in Babylon. Many of the Jews continued to live throughout that area where these Magi would eventually come from. For more than 500 years, devout Jews had lived in that region, had shared their scriptures and the promise of the coming Messiah with the people among whom they had lived. But I think there's another even more compelling way these people knew. It's Daniel. Remember Daniel's prophecy? Daniel is taken in that earliest time by Nebuchadnezzar back to Babylon. And he's there through his entire ministry. In Daniel chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar had a dream. You remember? And he sent for the Magi of Babylon to tell him what the dream was and to explain it. None of them could do so, so he commanded they all be killed. And when they come to Daniel and his friends to execute them, Daniel asks for more time, and you remember the story. God reveals to him both the dream and its meaning. And as a reward, Nebuchadnezzar does something fascinating. Turn back to Daniel for a moment. Daniel chapter 2. Daniel chapter 2, verse 46, then King Nebuchadnezzar fell on his face and did homage to Daniel. He gave orders to present to him an offering and a fragrant incense. The king answered Daniel and said, surely your God is God of gods and a Lord of kings and a revealer of mysteries, since you have been able to reveal this mystery. Verse 48, then the king promoted Daniel and gave him many great gifts, and he made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon, and watch this, chief prefect over all the wise men of Babylon. Now go over to chapter 5. This fast forwards. Nebuchadnezzar's dead. His grandson, Belshazzar, is on the throne, the last king of Babylon. The queen mother, Nebuchadnezzar's queen, comes in to speak to Belshazzar. Notice what she says in chapter 5 and verse 11. There is a man in your kingdom, speaking of Daniel, in whom is a spirit of the holy gods. And in the days of your father, illumination, insight, and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, appointed him chief of the magicians, conjurers, Chaldeans, and diviners. 4 categories. And if you look in the Septuagint, you'll find that the Greek word magi is in this verse. Daniel was chief of the Magi of Babylon. Undoubtedly, he used his influence to direct those under his authority to the true God. We see records of that even in his own prophecy. He would have certainly shared the Old Testament scripture with the wise men of Babylon. But even more interesting is think about all that was revealed to Daniel about the Messiah while he was in Babylon. I wish I had time to take you back and walk you through Daniel, but let me just remind you. In Daniel chapter 2, verses 36 to 45, Daniel learns that there will be a series of world empires, and that those world empires will culminate in an eternal kingdom that God himself will establish. So who's going to rule over that eternal kingdom? Well, in Daniel chapter 7, verses 13 and 14, Daniel reveals that that final kingdom will be ruled over by a divine Messiah. He will come up to the Ancient of Days. He'll be like a son of man, and he'll be given a kingdom and dominion that lasts forever. But it even goes further. Again, I wish we could go back and walk through this, but in Daniel chapter 9, verses 25 and 26, Daniel even prophesies that the Messiah will come and die at a certain time. If you study Daniel 9, verses 25 and 26, it becomes a simple math problem. And when you work out the math problem, you have Messiah dying in about 30 to 33 AD. So they knew when Messiah would die. Therefore, they knew about when he would come. And so there was this anticipation, even among the pagan world, of this great world ruler who would come. Where did they hear about that? Through the prophecies of the Old Testament, and specifically through Daniel. Apparently, the truth the Magi had learned from the Jews living among them in Babylon and from Daniel and his prophecy continued to influence their thinking even up to the time of the Messiah. And at the birth of Christ, the Magi were still familiar with those prophecies, still living in anticipation of them, and God appeared to them in the form of the Shekinah to indicate that it had happened. The Messiah had been born. That's why they came searching in Jerusalem for the one born King of the Jews. What we will discover is that God, in his providence, in his sovereign grace, reached down into the idolatry of Zoroastrianism and ripped these men to himself in grace. But what are the lessons that we can begin to see in this amazing account? These are not the main point of the text. We'll get to that, Lord willing, next Sunday. But what are the lessons we can begin to see in this amazing account? There are three of them that stand out to me. Number one, the Messiah would be rejected by his own people, but Gentiles from the nations would gladly receive and honor him. Here at the very beginning of his life, we see this unfold. Herod, the leaders, the religious leaders of the nation, even the people of Israel are yawning and uninterested. But here come these former idolaters whom God has rescued to worship Jesus. It's interesting, isn't it, that the Gospel of Matthew begins that way? And how does it end? With Jesus saying to his disciples, "Go into all the nations and make disciples." We sit here this morning, most of us, as the wonderful example of the grace of God in searching out people from the nations, from every tongue and tribe. This is the Messiah. Secondly, this story, I think, anticipates the suffering Messiah and what he would eventually endure. Think about this. Jesus at this point is less than 2 years old, and the hostility against him has already reached a murderous pitch. It's also interesting to note that the title that the Magi used for him here in chapter 2, in verse 2, King of the Jews, that title does not appear again in Matthew's gospel until it appears 3 times in the 27th chapter. Let me show you. Turn to Matthew 27. They come seeking the King of the Jews. The next time we hear of the King of the Jews is here in Matthew 27. Notice verse 11. Now Jesus stood before the governor, and the governor questioned him, saying, "Are you the King of the Jews?" And Jesus said to him, "It is as you say. Yes, I am." Then look at verse 29. After weaving a crown of thorns, the soldiers put it on his head and a reed in his right hand, and they kneeled down before him and mocked him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And then the third time it appears is in verse 37. They put up above his head the charge against him, which read, "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews." Do you see what Matthew's telling us? We have a great king, but the greatness, the glory, the majesty of our king is most profoundly shown in his suffering for us. This is the greatness of our king. His birth is announced. He is the Messiah, the divine Messiah who's come. And he came to suffer for sinners. Thirdly, the lesson we learn from this text is that Messiah is the king not only of the Jewish people, but of all people. I mean, think about it. At his birth, God made this clear. When God chose to announce the arrival of his son, he did so, first of all, through some humble Jewish shepherds in Bethlehem. And then through some powerful and influential Gentiles from modern-day Iran. You see the point? You have humble, salt-of-the-earth Jewish shepherds, and you have kingmaker, powerful, influential Gentiles. You see, regardless of our background, our ethnicity, our external circumstances, God demands that we acknowledge the child in Bethlehem as king. The only proper response to Jesus Christ is to fall at his feet and worship, because he's the promised one. He's the divine Messiah. He is the only rightful king of the Jews, of the Gentiles, of the nations, of every person. He is your rightful king. Let me ask you, and I really want you to think about this. I really want you to answer this in your mind. Have you ever truly acknowledged Jesus Christ's right to rule you? Have you ever acknowledged Jesus Christ's right to rule you? Have you ever bowed your knee and your heart and your will to his? As we're learning from Romans 4, that's the essence of true saving faith. And I don't care how much you gather to celebrate Christmas, if you have not acknowledged him as your king, then he's not your king. The real lesson of Christmas is that Jesus Christ is your rightful king. And the key question for you to weigh through this Christmas season is whose response to Jesus in this story best reflects your own. Let me say that again. Whose response in this story best reflects your response to Jesus Christ? Maybe you're sitting here this morning and say, "Tom, of course, I'm a Christian. I acknowledge Jesus as my king. I have bowed my will to his." Well, that's wonderful. So let me ask you, are you living in light of the implications of that? He is your king. So what about how you're living? Are you allowing Jesus to be your king in how you think, in the attitudes you display, in the words you speak, in how you behave, in how you interact with your spouse and with your children and your parents and with your employer, your employees, at school, your friends? Is Jesus Christ truly your king? He himself said, "Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and not do the things which I say?" Doesn't make any sense. Don't say I'm your king and do what you want to do. So my question to all of us is, are we really living in the light of, under the implication of Jesus is my rightful king. I am not my own. I have no right to say how I will think about anything. I have no right to say how I will choose and what decisions I will make. I have no right to do anything in an autonomous way. He is my king. Let me encourage you today, if that's what you claim, renew your resolve to follow him as king. That's what genuine faith looks like. And anything short of that is not genuine faith in Jesus Christ. You've believed in someone else, or you haven't believed at all. He is the Messiah and the rightful king. Let's pray together. Our Father, many of us here today give you thanks because in your grace, in your sovereign grace, you have sought us out and you've plucked us out of idolatry and paganism just like you did the Magi. And Lord, we can only praise you. We can only do what they did, and that is fall at your feet and worship. Father, help us to live as those who know you and your Son as King. Help us to live in light of that. Remind us that our lives and our daily decisions are not our own. Lord, help us to live as his subjects. Father, I pray for those here this morning who perhaps have not confessed Jesus as King, or perhaps who have, and yet, Lord, their lives reflect nothing of submission to Jesus Christ. Oh, Lord, strip away the blindness. Strip away the facade. Don't let them hide behind that false profession. Help them to see that Jesus either is King or he's not. And may this be the season when they bow their knee to him and acknowledge him as their rightful King for time and eternity. I pray in Jesus' name, amen.